The 2005 episode The Unquiet Dead sees the Doctor and Rose fighting ghostly aliens alongside Charles Dickens. He, over the course of the story, learns to open himself up to a reality that is stranger and more wonderful than he'd believed, mirroring, on some level, Rose's arc in the previous episode. But all of these particularities of characterization can get lost in the iconicness of a figure like Dickens. Because this formula of famous person from history plus vaguely relevant monster of the week, the so-called celebrity historical, soon became a staple of post-revival Doctor Who. As a genre of episode, it's grounded in an understanding of history that revolves around exceptional individuals. And while great man theories of history are not necessarily reliant on greatness being innate, in Doctor Who it almost always is. It's hard to take the assertion that Shakespeare is
the genius, the most human there's ever been,
as referring to literal writing skills he developed over the course of a career, rather than some deeper facet of his soul. The cold open of the 2023 special Wild Blue Yonder accelerates the celebrity historical into self-parody. From what I can tell by skimming the Wikipedia page, and that is the extent of my expertise in any real-world history I'll be discussing, whether or not Isaac Newton was inspired by an apple falling from a tree is a matter of some debate. A debate which is settled here by the reveal that, rather than the apple or something internal to Newton's own thinking, the Doctor and Donna are responsible for his discovering the theory of gravity. The TARDIS crashing into the story emphasizes that this never could have been a true telling of history. This version of Newton is pure fiction, but it almost feels like that's the point. The Devil's Cord from the following season shares this sensibility, a high camp take on the celebrity story which refuses the very premise of historical accuracy. It's less documentary than theater, playing out a script it assumes you already know. Most of the episode isn't even a celebrity historical in form. It's about a surreal alternate universe where music is dying. The Beatles just wander around in the background. The villain of Devil's Cord was summoned into the universe by what they describe as
a genius,
and can only be banished by the same. The question of what genius is, then, becomes central to the resolution. As the Doctor puts it,
sometimes genius is just hard work.
Yeah?
Which would be a savvy refutation of the way the show has previously discussed such things, if it weren't for the fact that the Doctor's hard-won style of genius isn't what saves the day. The Beatles do. They in fact overcome their social context, the dystopian setting which discourages them from cultivating the relevant skills, to achieve this feat of musical genius. Great men in Doctor Who are not products of their environment. They are great because they transcend their moment, often in outright fantastical ways. Shakespeare can see through the psychic paper. More than one of these men are compared to the Doctor in dialogue, which is itself indicative of this transcending of one's era, because the Doctor and those who travel with them exist outside of history, slipping between times and places and narratives while never being of any of them. What this means is that, as academic Vanessa de Kauwe points out, the Doctor enjoys the practical benefits of the elite in that he has absolute social, political, and financial freedom thanks to TARDIS technology. We see this at play in The Unquiet Dead. Gwyneth, a servant at the house they found themselves in, observes of Rose that,
"You think I'm stupid?"
Despite attempts at bonding, Rose's relationship with Gwyneth is defined by the latter being from this time period while Rose is not. The TARDIS's infinite wardrobe lets her move through Gwyneth's world as a noblewoman, but more than that, she believes she has access to objective truths of how the universe works that Gwyneth doesn't. Rose's position as time traveler, as Doctor Who protagonist, supersedes her own working-class background. The Shakespeare Code, which aired a couple years later, attempts to apply this same logic to race rather than class. When Martha expresses fear for her safety as a black woman in this time period, the Doctor says,
"I'm not even human, just walk about like you own the place, it works for me."
Many people, in the decades since this episode aired, have discussed the inadequacy of this response. Martha's ability to play the role of the Doctor Who companion as it has been traditionally conceived, as someone who can exist outside of any given historical context, is in tension with the concern she raises here, and the episode fails to reconcile these ideas. The one episode in Nchurikawa's first season as the Doctor, which deals explicitly with race, takes the other extreme. In Dot and Bubble, white supremacy prevents him from being the main character of Doctor Who, both in the literal sense of his inability to save the day, and in the metatextual sense of being a Dr. Light story. Jodie Whittaker's Doctor faces a different situation. As a white woman, there is a place for her in traditional Doctor Who, but it's a secondary one. In The Witchfinders, succeeding as a hero requires at times deferring to her white guy teammate. The psychic paper, a physical embodiment of the Doctor's ability to go wherever they please and take charge of any situation, fails her.
We're your witchfinder, sire.
Witchfinder's assistant.
Assistant being, of course, the old-fashioned term for the female co-lead of Doctor Who. Witchfinders is also a celebrity historical. But King James, despite briefly seeming like he might slot into the team, turns out to be an antagonist. The episode's other monster is also royalty, an alien queen possessing the body of a human woman, who was, prior to being overtaken by the alien mud, the self-appointed town witchfinder who married up. In an episode that positions witch hunts as gendered violence, Becca Savage is explicitly a woman who is less interested in systemic change than in climbing the ranks herself. When Willa, the local to this time period we're encouraged to sympathize with, says,
"There are more powerful people here than kings and queens. There's us. Together."
There's a seed of an idea here, a refusal to aspire to the kind of greatness that would include men like James. The episode ends with the promise that none of what has taken place will be a part of recorded history. Because it can't be, of course, none of this happened. But in this fact, there is movement towards the idea that maybe the historical record, as written by the victors, is not where we should be looking for value. In the 2010 episode Vincent and the Doctor, our heroes bring Vincent van Gogh to the present day to hear the reverence with which his paintings are now spoken of. But Amy and the Doctor have to confront the fact that this transformative moment did not cure his mental illness. Historical greatness in this context is less anything to do with actual history than it is the ultimate external validation, exaggerated to an extreme that none of us could ever hope to experience, and thus making the story's point about the limitations of such validation as forcefully as possible. There's a running joke in more than one of these episodes where one of the main characters quotes the celebrity's work at them, and in doing so suggests the ideas in the first place. Vincent and the Doctor plays the same beat straight. After Van Gogh destroys the famous sunflowers painting, Amy spends the rest of the episode trying to persuade him that said flowers would make a good subject. Whether he will recreate the painting becomes an open question with real thematic stakes. Will this human being become the iconic artist we know him to be? And the answer in the end is yes. He is great, but not because of some innate magic. He's great because someone cared. The Waters of Mars is a celebrity historical set in the future, because by 2009 the show had established itself enough that it could do this kind of self-reflexive premise. The Doctor knows who these people are and how their story ends, but for once, the audience does not begin the episode with the same knowledge. This means that when he has to decide whether to intervene in history as he knows it, it feels like a real decision. Elizabeth Sandifer, author of the blog TARDIS Ruditorum, writes of this episode, "This is not a fixed point in time in the same way that Pompeii is, and it cannot possibly be. And even as the story tries to suture it inexorably into the present day by having everything be a consequence of events of 2008, it can't. Because, of course, the events of 2008 it turns to are the Dalek invasion on the day the Earth was dragged across the universe, which are also events that didn't actually happen." This mismatch allows the episode to question the foundations of the celebrity historical by highlighting how arbitrary this kind of hero worship is. The textbook's eye view of history is dehumanizing, and that it posits a worldview where a person's life is not valuable in and of itself, but instead because of the effect it could have on some hypothetical future. The 2018 episode Rosa attempts to apply the formula at hand to the titular Rosa Parks. Upon closer examination, though, Rosa doesn't much resemble earlier entries in the genre. Parks does not team up with the Doctor and friends to defeat the episode's big bad. She's never aware of the actual plot. I assume this is because Rosa Parks fights aliens would have been in poor taste, but then one has to ask why they bothered at all. Because the result is that Parks has no agency in a story that is nominally about her. As the writer behind the blog Gigahoo puts it, disinterest in the protest, paradoxically, is embedded in the plot structure, even as it fetishizes the moment. Because Rosa renders the event something of a sham. First unstaged by a white man, then restaged by a white woman, both working from the basis of its own historicization. This process immediately inserting itself as the actual genesis of the event and making it arbitrary. One of those bootstrap paradox happenings that originates not from the conditions of the world, but from nowhere at all. An activist like Parks is poorly suited to the celebrity historical format. The episode wants to make her an amazing hero who transcends her time and place the way Shakespeare does, but the resulting story is incoherent because the thing that made Rosa Parks famous is all about her circumstances. Vincent and the Doctor posits that maybe a better world for Van Gogh would have meant
hundreds of new paintings.
But in a truly just world, Parks would have never needed to do any of the things that we remember her for. The celebrity historical as a framework consistently comes into conflict with the show's concerted effort in recent years to showcase more diverse characters and stories. In the 2020 episode Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, the Doctor promises the title character that
Tesla, you're gonna change the world.
but at least as this story presents things, he didn't. None of his work had lasting impact. He's a brilliant inventor who was hampered by his inability to sell his inventions to a mass audience, and it's explicit that this is partially due to the xenophobia he faces as an immigrant in the US. But I like Tesla here. I don't think had a lasting impact on all of human civilization is a metric by which we should judge people. But Doctor Who does. So many celebrity historicals emphasize how long a shadow their hero casts in their field, but that only works as framing if you're only ever telling stories about the people who succeeded. And because we live in a world where success comes easier for some people than others, the limits of this approach become clear the moment you try to expand beyond the white British mainstream. Then you have the fact that telling history that has been previously pushed to the side requires a lot more telling. The show lacks faith that the audience has heard of these people, and so we get the oft-remarked upon habit of Whittaker's Doctor to exposit history to the audience. There's a moment in 2021's War of the Sontarans where Dan, getting his bearings on his first trip into the past, asks,
So let me just get this straight. She's like a real person from history.
and while you could argue that this line isn't about Mary Seacole in particular, but just him wrapping his head around the existence of time travel, surely we can all agree this question never would have been asked about, say, Queen Victoria. In an article about alternate history stories, literary critic Catherine Gallagher points out that their use of real-world historical figures is reliant on audience recognition of them as such. One name refers to both a real person and a character within the story, and our experience of the character consists of the interplay between these two things. To paraphrase, we might want to say that the Charles Dickens of The Unquiet Dead is fictional, but that would not be entirely accurate. The historical Dickens is not just a source, but an inextricable component of the meaning of the double referent. A celebrity historical which does not assume audience knowledge of its celebrity is a fundamentally different thing. These recent stories don't derive drama from that gap the way Waters of Mars does, either. They treat it as an inconvenience to overcome. Perhaps the ultimate expression of Gallagher's point is an episode like Robot of Sherwood, which centers on a celebrity character who the story acknowledges as ahistorical.
No such thing as Robin Hood.
But the structure of the narrative holds. Audience knowledge of the figure in question is more important to this genre than historical reality is. And Robot of Sherwood is a celebration of this fact, an ode to the power of fiction.
History is a burden. Stories can make us fly.
A historical episode of Doctor Who is almost always a genre pastiche first and foremost. A western or a ghost story or a period romance. The traditional celebrity historical falls into this category too. Many focus on fiction writers thrust into situations which resemble the works they're known for. Even Vincent and the Doctor shows the Doctor and Amy stepping into Van Gogh's paintings. I think a lot about this line from 2018's Demons of the Punjab.
The Punjab is not bad for foreigners, though.
The protagonists of Doctor Who can understand any language as if it was their native tongue. As a result, language is never something we're asked to think about as existing within cultural contexts. But an episode being about colonial violence demonstrates the absurdity of this. Of course, the fact that a white Brit is speaking fluent Punjabi is notable, which is to say that the Doctor's whiteness marks her in this episode. She cannot, in fact, walk about like she owns the place. I mean, the power dynamic is slanted such that I imagine she could have thrown around the psychic paper, positioned herself as a colonial authority. But that isn't the same thing as earning these people's trust. Instead, Yaz has to take the lead on that front. Because it's not true, actually, that a white man's body does not have a politics, that it can exist outside of history. That's only true from within a worldview that continues to take whiteness and maleness as default. That's only true if you still want to tell the same kinds of stories as before, if every episode has to fit into a pre-existing framework, to center on a recognizable name. But there are places you can go and stories you can tell about marginalized people which aren't solely about the tragedy of what their lives aren't.
Never did this when I was a man.
Demons of the Punjab is not a celebrity historical. It's a portrait of a handful of normal people's experience of a historical moment. And while Demons is far from the first historical done this way, it is the one that best makes the case for the style's necessity. Historian Fiona Hobden, writing about the 2008 episode The Fires of Pompeii, explains that Often in the popular media, history is what happened, and historical investigation or representation aims to discover the truth. But for the professional historian, the past is a fragmented and ephemeral space, the product of diverse literary and pictorial narratives, which changes as the narratives, shaped by their production contexts, shift and combine in different ways. The storytelling potential of great men has long since run its course. The celebrity historical is dead. Long live every strange, ephemeral fragment that comes after.